berth 302. The radiation portal alarm did not go off. The density imaging screen showed something that didn't match the manifest. Inspector Dana Reyes looked at the profile a second time, then a third. The outbound container was declared as industrial pump housings used for reprocessing. The scan said otherwise. The density pattern was wrong, too uniform, too precise. Machine components do not image like cast iron pump bodies. This did. She flagged the container and called her supervisor. Within 2 hours, the Naval Criminal Investigative Service had a case number. What Reyes had stopped was not a customs paperwork error, it was the tail end of a theft operation that had been running quietly inside a Southern California defense subcontractor warehouse since late 2022. Authentic F-18 Super Hornet actuator assemblies, mislabeled, crated, moving through a shell freight forwarder toward Rotterdam. The paperwork was clean, the radiation scan was clean, but the physics of what was in that container told a different story, and Dana Reyes had been doing this job long enough to trust what the imaging screen showed her. 11 weeks later, NCIS and the Defense Criminal Investigative Service would arrest 9 people across 3 simultaneous sites. Total value of diverted components approximately $47 million. It started with 1 flag on 1 shift at $12 per scan. The Port of Long Beach processes roughly 9 million standard container units per year. On a given afternoon, the second shift at berth 302 handles dozens of outbound inspections. The automated targeting system scores each shipment before it reaches the physical inspection lane. High-risk profiles get pulled. Low-risk profiles clear on portal scan alone. The container flagged as IP-U27741 had scored low risk. Declared contents used industrial pump housings, destination Rotterdam, shipper a freight forwarding company registered in Delaware 4 months prior. Reyes had not pulled it for secondary based on the risk score. She pulled it because the density gradient on the imaging monitor did not behave like cast metal pump housings. Pump housings are irregular. They have chambers, ports, voids. The density profile on her screen was too consistent across the cross-sectional slices. It looked like precision-machined flat components stacked in parallel. She had seen this pattern before on machine tool parts, on aviation hardware, on engine components. She held the container and reached for her radio. NCIS Special Agent Marcus Tully reached berth 302 at 4:19 p.m. He brought a manifest specialist from CBP and requested a tailgate inspection under NCIS authority. 2 longshoremen cut the seal under port security supervision. The container held 41 individual crates, each stenciled with the same reference number, IPH 200 series. Inside, the first crate opened hydraulic actuator assemblies wrapped in protective foam, tagged with part numbers that Tully recognized immediately. He photographed 3 of the tags before the manifest specialist confirmed what they were. F-18 Super Hornet flight control actuator assemblies, specifically outboard leading-edge flap actuators. Not surplus, not scrap, not pull for parts. Serviceable units, still within manufacturer tolerance windows based on the calibration stamps on the housings. Tully secured the container. He called his senior resident agent and then called DCIS. The shipper of record was a Delaware-registered LLC called Meridian Export Solutions. 4 months old. No operating history, no prior shipments. The freight forwarder of record was a Rotterdam company with a legitimate registration but thin transactional history. The ultimate consignee listed on the export control documents was a light industrial procurement company in a third country with no verifiable connection to any aviation maintenance operation. Someone had built a paper corridor, not a sloppy one. The corporate layering was competent, but the actuators themselves were too specific to hide. F-18 flap actuators are Export Administration Regulations controlled items. Moving them out of the country without State Department authorization under ITAR is a federal crime regardless of what the crates say on the outside. NCIS and DCIS opened a joint investigation file that evening. The file was classified as an active procurement fraud and illegal export case. The container was seized, impounded, and removed to a secure federal storage facility in the harbor complex. The question that opened the investigation: where did the actuators come from? Part numbers tell stories. Each actuator in the crates carried a government property tag number, a contract number, and a receiving warehouse code. The receiving warehouse code pointed to a defense subcontractor facility in Chatsworth, California. The company held maintenance and supply chain management contracts with the Navy for aviation component logistics. Specifically, they managed excess inventory and part cycle tracking for naval aviation components at several West Coast facilities. DCIS pulled the contract records. The Chatsworth facility had received those actuator assemblies under a Navy excess inventory drawdown program. Under the program terms, components designated as excess to current requirements were to be either redistributed to other Navy units, returned to depot, or documented as scrapped if beyond serviceable life. The actuators in the container were not beyond serviceable life, they had been marked as scrapped. DCIS analysts requested the scrap documentation for the IPH-220 series lot. The paperwork existed, it was filed correctly, it showed the units as demilitarized and disposed of through a certified scrap contractor in early April 2026. There was one problem: the units in the container had calibration stamps dated March 2026. Parts marked as scrapped in April cannot have calibration records from March unless someone documented the scrapping before it happened. The paperwork had been written in advance of a destruction that never occurred. This was no longer just an export violation. This was active fraud against the United States government, conducted from inside a cleared defense contractor facility. DCIS and NCIS began building the surveillance package in the first week of May 2026. The Chatsworth facility was a legitimate operation employing more than 200 people across its logistics, maintenance, and administrative functions. The fraud was not facility-wide. DCIS analysts needed to identify the specific individual or individuals with access to both the physical components and the documentation system. The scrap documentation trail pointed to one person with consistent authorization across all the fraudulent disposal records: the supply chain manager for excess inventory disposition. His name was Alan Voss. He had been with the company 6 years. He held a security clearance, a clean personnel file, and direct authority over the documentation workflow for excess component drawdown. I spent time going through the DCIS case reconstruction on this, and one detail kept pulling at me. Voss was not the most senior person in that facility. He was not the only person with access to the inventory system, but he was the only person who combined documentation authority with physical warehouse access, and who had been in that specific role for the entire period the fraud appears to have run. The investigators saw it within the first week. The question was how long it had been going on and how much had already moved. Agents returned to the surveillance van day after day, watching the same loading dock, the same unmarked sedans, the same couriers moving in and out of the facility. 4 more weeks of body camera footage and dash camera recordings before the picture became clear. NCIS requested a Title III wiretap authorization covering Voss's personal phone and one work email account. The application was supported by the physical evidence from the container, the fraudulent scrap records, and financial analysis showing that Voss had made a series of cash deposits over the past 18 months, totaling approximately $340,000. None of the deposits triggered automatic bank reporting thresholds individually. Together, they formed a pattern inconsistent with his salary. On May 14, 2026, the approval came through. Agents at the dispatch center logged the authorization, and the surveillance operation shifted into a new phase. Every call now recorded. Every meet now covered by undercover surveillance vehicles parked in rotating positions around the Chatsworth facility. Within the first 10 days of intercepts, NCIS established contact between Voss and a logistics broker operating out of a commercial mailbox address in Torrance, California. The broker, identified in the file as Raymond Dulac, appeared to serve as the intermediary between Voss and the export network. Dulac communicated with the Rotterdam freight forwarder and, through that channel, with the ultimate buyer network in the third country. Here is the part that doesn't sit right even now, looking back at the timeline. Voss had been doing this since late 2022. The investigation covered components valued at $47 million over that period. For 3.5 years, not a single routine audit caught the pattern. The scrap documentation was accurate on its face. The component counts balanced. The only thing that exposed the operation was a density gradient on a port imaging screen that a second shift inspector chose not to ignore. Body camera footage, dash camera footage, federal agents walking the same storage bays, photographing the same components, logging the same serial numbers for 3.5 years. $47 million in Navy aviation components moving out the door. Every shipment cleared because the paperwork said so. What this tells us about cleared facility insider fraud is uncomfortable. The controls that exist to prevent it are largely documentation controls. They work when the person falsifying the documentation is bad at it. When the person is competent and has had years to refine the workflow, the documentation controls do not catch it. Physical inspection catches it, or luck catches it. In this case, it was a combination of professional attention and physics. Voss did not know about the density imaging flag for several days. By the time Meridian Export Solutions began making inquiries about the container hold at the port, NCIS was already monitoring those communications. The inquiry itself became evidence. Voss's phone showed a call to Dulac at 6:44 p.m. on April 28, 2 hours after the container was flagged. The call lasted 11 minutes. NCIS recorded it. Voss told Dulac the container was being held. Dulac told him to say nothing and wait. Dulac said the forwarder in Rotterdam would handle the documentation issue on their end. They did not know the documentation issue was a federal criminal seizure. Over 3 weeks, agents in the surveillance van logged intercept after intercept, building the network on the monitor wall. Dulac's voice. Dulac's contacts. Dulac running relationships with 2 other suppliers of diverted components who had no connection to the Chatsworth facility. NCIS flagged those threads to DCIS. The body camera footage, the dash camera recordings, the wiretap logs, all of it stayed focused on the Chatsworth operation. Unpopular opinion, the procurement fraud detection system that let this run for 3.5 years is more culpable than Alan Voss. Voss exploited a specific gap in excess inventory documentation that the contracting system has known about for decades. The controls were inadequate. Everyone in the oversight chain signed off on annual audits that cleared the paperwork because the paperwork was competently falsified. The system produced this outcome by design. That does not reduce Voss's legal liability. It does mean the $47 million figure is not an anomaly. It is what the gap produces when someone decides to use it. What's most surprising about this case isn't the scale. $47 million over 3.5 years from a single facility is significant, but not unprecedented in defense procurement fraud. What's surprising is the exit route. Moving flight control actuators through a shell exporter to Rotterdam, consigned to an entity in a third country with no aviation infrastructure on record. Someone on the buying end knew exactly what they were purchasing. Serviceable F-18 actuators have a very specific market. The components are not general-use hardware. Whoever was at the end of that supply chain had the technical knowledge to identify and use them. That part of the network, the ultimate buyer, was never fully identified before this video was produced. By mid-June 2026, the NCIS-DCIS investigation had built sufficient evidence for arrest warrants on 6 individuals: Voss, Dulac, and 4 members of the export network, including the principals of Meridian Export Solutions and their contact at the Rotterdam freight forwarder. 3 additional warrants covered 2 warehouse employees at a rented storage bay in Torrance that surveillance had identified as a staging location, and 1 financial intermediary who had processed the cash payments to Voss. The Torrance storage bay had been identified through vehicle surveillance. Dulac's vehicle was photographed visiting the location on 3 separate occasions. A controlled follow-up using a surveillance aircraft and ground units established that crated components were being moved in and out of the bay in a rental van. NCIS obtained a search warrant and conducted a covert entry inspection. Inside 14 crated actuator, assemblies of the same type as the seized container, plus documentation confirming at least 2 prior successful shipments that had cleared port inspection before the April flag. That meant the April container was not the first. 2 prior shipments had gone through, undetected. DCIS and NCIS agents pulled Port Authority records at the evidence collection scene, forensic photography documenting every page. 2 prior containers had cleared, both declared as industrial parts, both routed through Rotterdam. When investigators pulled the port imaging records, there was nothing on screen. 90-day retention. The footage was gone. The shipments were gone. $47 million was the estimated total. How much of that had already reached the end buyer before the April flag was unknown? Investigators placed it at somewhere between $12 and $18 million in prior successful deliveries, based on the volume of component lots documented as scrapped at the Chatsworth facility over the preceding 18 months. The warrants were ready. The arrest teams were briefed. July 15, 2026 was selected as the takedown date, a Tuesday, early morning, coordinated to hit all 3 sites before the start of the Chatsworth facility's first shift. Then, at 11:14 p.m. on July 14, a monitoring analyst at NCIS called the lead case agent with a problem. Voss's phone had just placed a call to a number not previously seen in the intercepts. The call lasted 4 minutes. The number was registered to a prepaid device. NCIS ran an emergency tower data request. The prepaid phone had pinged a cell tower in Simi Valley 15 minutes after the call, then gone dark. Someone may have been tipped off. The arrest team had 6 hours to decide whether to move up the timeline or hold. The lead NCIS supervisory agent convened a call at midnight. The options were execute immediately, delay 48 hours and monitor, or split the operation and hit the storage bay and Dulac's location first while holding on Voss. Each option carried risk. Moving up immediately compressed the tactical preparation. Delaying risked Voss moving or destroying evidence. Splitting the operation risked that arrests at one site would tip Voss before agents reached him. Put yourself in that position for a second. Midnight, 6 sites to coordinate. A warrant structure built around simultaneous execution. 1 unknown phone call. And a senior agent has to decide by 1 a.m. The decision was to execute at 4:30 a.m., 90 minutes earlier than planned. The tactical teams were woken up and briefed at 1:15.
If you're engaged qualified for a license, I guess a wise Ritz and eggshell and that can tell you what the one's first person desk alone action to he Rick and the rest. He would go the six house the 5 hours. So we saw it all. This final or the different protect unrelated to the trade right over. Now Voss was inside here in bed. He was able to custody with that incident and storage bay, the Torrance storage bay, a private security contact unrelated to the network, or Voss had received a partial warning and did not fully act on it.
By the way, when NCIS agents knocked on the door of the Simi Valley resident at 42 a.m., Alan Voss was inside, in bed. He was taken into custody without incident. At the Torrance storage bay, a private security contractor working overnight for the property management company had observed unusual activity at 3:35 a.m. He called the property manager rather than 911.
By the time the confusion was sorted out and NCIS was informed, the tactical entry team had already secured the bay. No one fled. No evidence was destroyed. But the 12-minute gap between the security contractor's call and NCIS being informed of it is worth sitting with. Would you have called 911 directly? Most people don't know what they're looking at when it's happening. That's not a criticism. It's a realistic detail about how these operations actually unfold. At the Chatsworth facility, FBI tactical and NCIS agents arrived at 4:38 a.m. and secured the facility perimeter. 2 overnight security staff were on site and were directed to a secure waiting area. The facility's inventory system was forensically imaged before any administrative staff arrived for the morning shift. The company's legal department was notified at 6:02 a.m. 4 employees in addition to Voss were taken into custody or detained for questioning. By 7:30 a.m. on July 15, all 9 individuals named in the warrant structure were in custody. Dulac was arrested at his apartment in Torrance at 4:44 a.m. He asked for a lawyer before agents finished reading him his rights. The principals of Meridian Export Solutions, a husband and wife team operating from a residential address in Irvine, were arrested simultaneously. Their home contained a secondary set of records that NCIS had not previously known existed, printed communications with the Rotterdam contact, payment records, and what appeared to be a component tracking spreadsheet covering not just the Chatsworth actuators, but parts from at least 2 other sources. DCIS flagged those 2 other sources for follow-on investigation. As of the date this script was produced, that investigation was ongoing and no arrests had been made in connection with it. Looking at this case in full, the real question is not why Alan Voss did it. People inside cleared facilities with access to high-value government property and documentation authority have committed procurement fraud for as long as those facilities have existed. The real question is what the Port of Long Beach Density Imaging Program represents as a detection mechanism for exactly this kind of export. The program was not designed to catch insider theft from defense facilities. It was designed to catch smuggled weapons and radioactive materials. What it caught here was a sophisticated export fraud because one inspector applied professional judgment to a number that didn't match. The system worked by accident. The question for the agencies involved is whether it should work by design. Comment yes if you think defense subcontractor audits need a physical verification component, not just documentation review. The argument against it is cost. The argument for it is $47 million. The charges filed on July 15 and July 16, 2026, covered conspiracy to defraud the United States, theft of government property, violations of the Arms Export Control Act and international traffic in arms regulations, money laundering, and obstruction. Voss faced the most serious exposure. The theft charges alone carried potential sentences of up to 10 years per count, and the ITAR violations added additional federal mandatory minimums depending on prosecution strategy. Federal agents transported the 14 actuator assemblies under escort, the handcuffed suspects already processed, the evidence chain documented in forensic photography at every transfer point. At the Naval Air Systems Command facility, technicians worked through each unit. All 14 confirmed serviceable. All 14 F-18 Super Hornet components returned to Navy inventory. The 41 crates from the original seized container at berth 302 were similarly authenticated and returned. Investigators spread the evidence across the interrogation room table, forensic photographs of serial numbers, shipping manifests, evidence collection logs, but the recovered components accounted for only a fraction of what had moved. The rest had cleared customs, passed through the Rotterdam forwarder, and vanished. Federal agents working the surveillance monitor wall traced the paper trail to a shell company, then hit a wall. No jurisdiction, no recovery. The end buyer's name never appeared on screen. The actuators that moved before April 28, 2026 are gone. One detail it stuck the calibration stamps. Every aviation component in government service carries a calibration or inspection stamp with a date. Whoever was buying these actuators knew to look for those stamps and knew what they meant. They weren't buying parts. They were buying airworthy hardware. That specificity narrows the field of possible end users considerably. Military aviation programs, foreign maintenance operations with F-18 compatible platforms, or intermediaries who would resell to those buyers. None of that is publicly confirmed. It is what the component type implies. Dana Reyes was not present at the July 15 arrests. She was working a day shift at berth 302. She learned about the outcome from her supervisor, who had received a call from NCIS that morning. Her single flag, entered into the port hold system at 21:54 p.m. on April 28, 2026, initiated a chain of events that produced 9 arrests, the seizure of 55 actuator assemblies worth approximately $29 million at replacement cost, and the identification of an insider fraud operation that had run undetected for 3.5 years. The network is dismantled. The actuators that left before April are somewhere else. The buyer who needed them still needs them. And the gap in documentation controls that made the Chatsworth operation possible still exists in cleared facilities across the country. If you want to see what happens when a federal investigation follows a single thread all the way back to its origin, subscribe. Cases like this one are what this channel covers. When agents pulled back the container doors on July 16, dash camera footage from the port captured the moment. The interior was bare metal and shadow. The container was empty.